Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture. This week, we see how the political climate in the United States changed significantly starting in the 1980s, undoing a lot of the social improvements that were achieved during the civil rights and the Chicano movement in the previous time period. So in the 1980s, the Reagan administration comes to power and brought the significant diminishing of social programs and any responsibility by the government to address social issues. Most Americans start to feel resentment about having social programs they feel aren't for them and having to pay for them through their taxes. Minorities are perceived as receiving special treatment in areas of jobs and education, and whites begin to speak of reverse discrimination, beginning to see themselves as the victims of the existing social programs for minority populations. We also see conservative Mexican Americans given a platform by the Republican Party, in particular to be used as a way to legitimize policies against affirmative action and bilingual education. One of these was Richard Rodriguez, who wrote his autobiography, Hunger of Memory, where he talked about the idea of private versus public culture and talked against bilingual education and affirmative action. His ideas at the time was that to be Mexican American, to speak Spanish, these were things that you should do in the privacy of your home, but that the public culture that Mexican Americans needed to have was an assimilated American one, and that was the way to get ahead in American society. The U.S. English organization came about during this time and promoted English as the official national language. Another spokesperson of this time period was Linda Chavez, who sought the abolition of affirmative action in bilingual education. She was the president of the U.S. English organization and opposed the Equal Rights Amendment that was still on the table around gender equality. She had been nominated to be Secretary of Labor, but this collapsed due to the Nannygate scandal, where it was made public that she hired undocumented immigrants as domestic workers in her home. This new conservative cultural move in the country resulted in the Chicano population focusing on electoral politics. The 24th Amendment eliminated the poll tax. In 1975, the Voting Rights Act was amended, extending voting rights to Mexican Americans in the Southwest. English literacy requirements were eliminated. And so these laws allowed for more Mexican Americans to participate in the electoral process, and an increase in the number of Chicano elected officials. Some highlights of these successes are Henry Cisneros, who was the first Mexican-American mayor in San Antonio in 140 years. And here in Denver, Federico Peña was the first Chicano mayor in 1983. Tony Anaya was the first Mexican-American governor in New Mexico. Other significant wins here in Colorado was Polly Barragan, who was the first Mexican-American woman elected to the Colorado Senate, and Gloria Molina, who was elected to the California State Assembly and the LA City Council. As a result of this increase in electoral politics, and the involvement of Chicanos in electoral politics, we see the creation of a number of new political organizations, such as the National Association of Latino Elected and Appointed Officials and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, both of these organized by Edward Roybal. The Southwest Voter Registration Drive was started by Willie Velasquez in Texas and was successful at contributing to the increase in Mexican Americans participating in voting. However, this increase in political participation and political representation, however, did not do much for the subsequent increase in incarceration of the Mexican American population during this time period. The impact of a decrease in social programs results in an increase in gang activity as youth find themselves marginalized in the educational system and without community activities that used to exist through social programs. Those had now all been cut. The draconian anti-drugs and anti-gang laws increased the number of Mexican Americans incarcerated. The 3 strikes law, in which offenders were convicted for non-violent drug-related 3rd strikes, also resulted in more people being incarcerated. In other words, you had, as the image there depicts, the California 3 strikes law dictated that by your 3rd offense, you would have to receive a sentence of 25 to life. The politics of law and order also took over at this time, which meant not giving Mexican Americans probation or parole, as well as an increase in racially motivated police violence. During this time period, we'd also see a number of immigration policies and laws coming to fruition. Immigration is linked to invaders, criminals, and the drug trade. In 1986, the Simpson-Mazzoli Act is passed in 1986, which prohibited employers from hiring undocumented workers and provided penalties for noncompliance. It also increased Border Patrol enforcement, and it also provided amnesty for immigrants who could prove they'd been in the country since 1982. So this did both things. On the one hand, it increased the policing and surveillance of the border and of undocumented people in the United States, but it also had an amnesty component to it, which allowed for a number of people who had been in the country to be legalized. And so some people found this immigration policy to be good because it allowed for their family members to become legalized in the United States. In the 1990s, you have the passage of the Illegal Immigration Reform and Individual Responsibility Act. This was passed under the Bill Clinton administration, expanding the list of crimes for which legal residents could be deported, and expedited removal and banned from reentry individuals for 5 years. So it expedited deportation, it expanded the number of crimes that legal residents could be deported for. If you were deported, you weren't allowed to try to re-enter the country for 5 years. And it also provided funding to increase the militarization of the border. This particular policy did not have an amnesty component to it, and it just made it that much harder for, or attempted to make it harder for undocumented people to come to the United States. And it also added to the image that was already out there about undocumented people being criminals. Another backlash that we see at this time is the English-only movement. As we talked about during the Chicano movement, it was a time period where bilingual education, for instance, was fought for and was gained in a number of school districts throughout the country. Here we have a backlash now against that to get rid of bilingual education and to establish English as the official language of the United States. You may or may not know that the United States does not have an official language. And one of the videos that I have listed will speak to that as well. And the English-only referendums appeared in states throughout the country with a high percentage of Latinx populations. Congress also cut funding to bilingual education programs as a way to undermine those programs as well. In California, in the 1990s, We saw a number of propositions put to the electorate there that were against or that targeted in particular Latinx communities and other populations of color. Proposition 187 in particular aimed to bar undocumented immigrants from receiving state-funded health, social, and educational resources and services. It aimed for undocumented immigrant children to prevent them from going to school or undocumented people from receiving health services at public hospitals. The argument was that they were using tax-funded services without paying any taxes. Although studies have shown how undocumented immigrants pay more in California state taxes than they use in services. The referendum passed in 1994 with 50% of African Americans and 31% of Spanish-speaking population voting in favor of it. It was declared unconstitutional, however, by the federal court. Now you may wonder, how is it possible that 31% of the Spanish-speaking population would vote in favor of it? Well, you have to remember that the Latinx community is not all necessarily in agreement politically. There are Mexican Americans that have been in the United States for generations, or that came, quote unquote, legally, who perceive immigrants coming from Mexico as undocumented folks as a bad thing, as people who are competitors for jobs for them. So we can understand then that there is a certain sector of the Mexican American population that will be in favor of a proposition that aims to make it harder for undocumented people to be here, and therefore hope that that meant that immigration would become lower. Another proposition that came out at this time in California was the anti-affirmative action proposition, Prop 209. And what we see, even to most recently, the most recent Supreme Court decision, the discussion around the use of affirmative action, in particular when it comes to college admissions, has been a consistent battle since affirmative action has existed. Now, this backlash against using affirmative action for college admissions takes place as the number of students of color in higher education and the number of faculty of color being hired are starting to increase. These individuals who were admitted at this time were perceived as, quote unquote, special admits and unqualified affirmative action hires. So the assumption was that if you were hired or admitted into the college through an affirmative action program, that you were by definition less qualified, which is not at all what the affirmative action law actually intended. It intended to provide more opportunities, equal opportunity for people of color to be hired into employment or to be admitted into colleges, but it did not say that you had to, or nor did it require that you had to hire people or admit people that were not qualified to be in those positions. The Bakke case in 1978 was one of the first cases that was brought up to try to undo affirmative action in education. It was a reverse discrimination case involving UC Davis Medical School, which had two separate admissions pools. One reserved a certain number of seats for students of color. The court ruled that quotas were illegal, but it did not say that using race as a factor in admissions was necessarily illegal. So it still allowed some room for race to be used as one of many factors in deciding who gets admitted into college. One of the major beneficiaries of affirmative action were actually white women. And so this assumption, right, that affirmative action gives a leg up to people of color that they don't deserve, or that they have been the ones who have benefited the most from affirmative action. Studies have shown that that is not the case, that white women are the ones who have benefited the most from affirmative action. Now, part of the argument was that white males were being discriminated against in favor of people of color, although studies have shown that they were minimally impacted by affirmative action. Proposition 209 was a referendum in 1996 put forward to the population in California to vote on that outlawed affirmative action in hiring, contracting, and college admissions. This results in a significant decrease of Latinx and African-American students in California universities. Other states like Texas followed in passing similar types of referendums. Now, while this becomes a time period of backlash and getting rid of social programs and attacking things like affirmative action and so on, this does not mean that the population during this time did not still organize and participate in activism. One of the areas in which we see this continued form of activism is in labor. In 1974, 2,000 women workers in El Paso, Texas, went on strike to protest low wages, poor benefits, and unfair treatment by management at the FARA garment industries. Strikes resulted in a consumer boycott of FARA products which ended up having a considerable impact on the strike. In Colorado, there was a strike at Coors Brewery, which also had a boycott component to it. It didn't end until 1987, when the company reached an agreement with its employees. We also see another miners' strike taking place from 1983 to 1986. As the reading pointed out, once again, women were involved as militant strikers and strike supporters and taking over the picket line when men were prohibited from doing so by a court injunction. So we have a similar situation again as when we talked about the Salt of the Earth strike. Farm workers, once again, are actively fighting now against environmental conditions, such as the spraying of pesticides in the field. Cesar Chavez fasted for 36 days to call attention to this issue and how children of migrant workers were dying from cancer as a result. One of the significant economic agreements that was made at this time that had an impact on our economy was NAFTA, which was meant to create trade between Canada, Mexico, and the United States. Now, this was originally supported by Mexican-American organizations and Mexican elites who believed that they could both benefit from a closer relationship between the United States and Mexico. However, it was opposed by organized labor who believed the agreement would result in the loss of American jobs, as American companies would undermine unions by moving their companies to Mexico where they could get cheaper labor. So this really opened what we have seen in the last 40 years or so of American companies leaving the United States and going to other countries, setting up shop in other countries where they could have access to cheaper labor. And this is where sort of the idea that Mexicans take American jobs really comes from. It's not that they come here and take jobs that Americans have or want to participate in, but that these companies left the United States, leaving those American workers without jobs and taking those companies overseas where they can make more profit because they're paying their laborers less. Unions began to realize that the only way that they would survive is if they increased representation of Latinx immigrant workers. In 1995, Mexican-American Linda Chavez Thompson is elected as executive vice president of one of the major unions here, the AFL-CIO. The union also changes its immigration stance in favor of immigrant rights. So in a way, this allowed for unions that before were hesitant to include immigrant workers into their organizations to include those workers as well. Now, this deal was not as successful or as beneficial as people thought or sold it to be. For instance, it resulted in not only loss of jobs in the US as these companies left, but it also failed to generate the number of jobs in Mexico that was promised. So NAFTA has become or became a very contentious deal that was made by the United States that really only ended up benefiting company owners who are now having access to cheaper labor, and basically made it easier for goods to cross borders. So this ends our lecture for this week. There is a video also on NAFTA that can better explain with concrete examples on what this meant and how this made things, facilitated some things and made things worse in other ways. But this gives you a sense of how the political climate changed in the United States after the movements of the 1960s and 1970s, and how we're still in a way seeing many of the effects of this political shift that happened, but also the economic impact of deals like NAFTA. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to seeing your thoughts on the discussion post. Have a wonderful week.